Black economics. This presentation is using the entrepreneurial and business ingenuity of blacks during slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and also as a template for a prospective renaissance for zip codes of poverty for people of color and poor white communities. Black thriftiness during slavery. Page 46, Region Focus, Spring 2007. See URL. As for blacks, some of those who were enslaved in the South managed to participate in the common economy on a limited basis. They sold their services on occasion, and a few established small businesses on the side. Their credit needs were filled by blacks who accumulated enough wealth to buy their freedom. These informal bankers collected other people's savings and used the funds to make small loans. Also, mutual aid societies pooled people's resources to offer a variety of services, including finances for black entrepreneurs. Meanwhile, blacks in the North created similar institutions to provide banking and other services to each other. As the nation's industrial and westward expansion increased the overall demand for capital during the mid-19th century, however, they realized other sources of credit were needed. Church and business leaders in the black community gathered in New York City in 1851 to discuss, among other things, the formation of a mutual savings loan. They believed a bank would help blacks buy their own homes and start businesses, as well as encourage thrift. Bodenborn has his own theories. Economic logic tells me that blacks just did and have the resources to keep a bank going, he explained. Banks prosper when they can tap into market wagers who need a depository and entrepreneurs with potentially lucrative projects. Black communities often had neither. Workers earning barely more than subsistence did not provide a reliable source of deposits, and black entrepreneurial projects were not the most promising of available set of projects. Continuing from that passage. During the Civil War, the federal government established banks administered by Union generals as a safe place for black soldiers and refugee camp workers, as well as emancipated slaves, to park their money. Two of these banks opened in 1864 in Beaufort, South Carolina, and Norfolk, Virginia, where a large number of black soldiers were stationed. After the war, hundreds of thousands of dollars sat in these banks unclaimed. Many depositors had either died or had returned home without closing out their accounts. Government and military officials decided to redirect this capital into a federally incorporated institution called the Freedom Savings and Trust Corporation in 1865. The bank eventually opened more than 30 branches, mostly in southern states, and accumulated about $3 million in deposits. The Freedmen's Bank was supposed to help newly emancipated blacks. Instead, it didn't survive the banking panic of 1873, when dozens of private commercial banks failed following the bankruptcy of a prominent railroad financier. The Freedom Banks went belly up a year later. To fill this gap in credit for black borrowers, black churches and fraternal organizations and benevolent societies began supporting formation of banks in the late 1880s. Individuals also started industrial loan companies, building and loan firms, and credit unions. Thanks in part to these institutions, black businesses and home ownership rates continued to rise after the Civil War, despite many social and legal barriers. Two earliest examples of black-owned banks were in the 5th District. The United Order of True Reformers obtained the first charter for a black-owned bank in March 1888 from the Virginia General Assembly. When the Richmond-based Black Bank eventually opened for business in 1889, it financed various enterprises, including a chain of grocery stores that operated in Virginia and Washington, D.C. but a series of bad loans and embezzlement scandals eventually forced the state to close the bank in 1910. Black policy, aka numbers era financing. The numbers game, found in Wikipedia. The numbers game is an illegal lottery played mostly in poor neighborhoods in the United States, where an bettor attempts to pick 3 digits to match those that will be randomly drawn the following day. In recent years, the number would be the last 3 digits of the handle. The amount racetrack bettors place on a race day at a major racetrack, published in racing journals and major newspapers in New York. A gambler placed a bet with a bookie at a tavern or other semi-private place that acts as a betting parlor. A runner carries the money and betting slips between the betting parlors and headquarters called a numbers bank or policy bank. The name policy is from a similarity to cheap insurance, both seen as a gamble on the future. By the early 20th century, the game was associated with poor communities and could be played for as little as a penny. One of the game's attraction to low-income working-class bettors was the ability to bet small amounts of money. Also, unlike state lotteries, bookies could extend credit to the bettor. Policy winners could avoid paying income tax. Different policy banks would offer different rates, though a payoff of 600 to 1 was typical. Since the odds of winning were 999 to 1 against, the expected profit for racketeers was enormous. The numbers racket in Harlem and Chicago. In Harlem, Francis A.J. Ianni, in his book Black Mafia, Ethnic Succession and Organized Crime, writes, by 1925 there are 30 black policy banks in Harlem, several of them large enough to collect bets in an area of 20 city blocks and across 3 or 4 avenues. By 1931, there were several big-time numbers operators, James Warner, Stephanie St. Clair in particular, Casper Holstein, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, Wilfred Runder, Jose Mero, Joseph Eson, Mississippi Eison, and Simeon Francis. The game survived despite periodic police crackdowns. In Chicago in the 1940s, Eddie Jones and his brothers earned more than $180,000 per week in the black community. While in jail for income tax evasion, Eddie Jones made acquaintance with Sam Giancana, a hitman for hire among top Italian mafia figures. Back on the street, the men became friends. Eddie taught Sam everything he knew about the policy game and how to memorize number combinations, and even hired Sam to operate one of his many lucrative establishments. Sam made his first fortune through Eddie. Aspiring to become a made man, Sam shared his new knowledge of a policy game with the Dons, who were impressed. By now, the Italian mafia focused their attention on the Jones market in the black community. Under orders from the Don, Sam was instructed to remove Eddie from his wealthy position and take over, to avoid being murdered by the mob. Eddie Jones walked away from his family enterprise. Stephanie St. Clair of Harlem, also found in Wikipedia under Stephanie St. Clair. Her numbers game involvement. Ms. Sinclair was involved in policy banking and a mixture of investing, gambling, and playing the lottery. Many banks at this time would not accept black customers, so they were not able to invest legally. Policy banking wasn't technically legal, but it was the only way for black individuals living in Harlem to invest their money. In this way, she used the underground economy in Harlem to address race politics. St. Clair helped the black community in Harlem by providing many jobs as number runners and other jobs within her business. Because of her success in the numbers game, she lived a lavish life, making over $20,000 a year in the 1920s. The present-day dilemma for black entrepreneurial financing. Absence of financing for blacks, POCs, and the poor. From an article in Forbes by Kerry Sheffield, How Progressive Policy Weakens African American Banks. Note the URL. She was a contributor about political economy. The Washington Post and other outlets have highlighted the decline of banks owned by African Americans. However, coverage hasn't connected that trend with post-recession Dodd-Frank regulations that accelerate the decline of community banks. The balance sheets of black-owned banks, along with minority-owned banks generally, which the government calls Minority Deposit Institution, MDIs, are similar to general community banks, according to the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, relying on core deposits to fund loans heavily weighted to residential and commercial real estate. The FDIC reports that the MDIs have been harder hit than the broader banking sector between 2001 and 2013. The failure rate for MDIs was about 3 times higher than it was for the industry as a whole, even though some MDIs, particularly Asian Pacific Islander-owned banks, have experienced recent growth in the number of charters and overall assets. This is not the case for black-owned banks. The FDIC reported there were just 25 black-owned American banks in 2014, a sharp plummet from 48 in 2001. Having noted these factors, the need for low-income communities to have based their own financial sources is evident when you see the social and economic effects which have occurred in the absence of those factors. Your political campaign is in the very unique position to advocate for these changes for working class and low-income communities, while burnishing your credibility in comparison to what your competitors will be offering. A change of the laws and tax codes will be necessary so that these financially stressed zip-coded communities could have the empowerment for their local and cultural expression of affluence and wealth. Thanks for whatever serious consideration is given to this. Me, Junior Bugsy Harpo, aka Twitter.com, Jacobin Trotsky, Yale 1972, Berkeley College.